Hey everyone, this is the Love of Cinema podcast. We like to talk movies. If you like to talk movies too, you come to the right place.
What Rajamouli does is he builds these experiences outward from that emotional core, and he builds the stunts and the action outward from what the story needs. Just taking what would normally be not a simple set piece, but an action set piece that you might see in a Hollywood or other foreign language film movie, and just dialing it up, several dozen notches. But he doesn't do that at the expense of any of the characters or at the expense of the story, which is something that other filmmakers could take a lesson from.
Let me ask you a question. How often do you find yourself walking out of the cinemas after watching a film that's more than 3 hours long and saying to yourself, man, I wish that was a bit longer? Not often, right? Because it's not easy to make a film that long, that's engrossing, entertaining, and has you completely glued for its entire duration. Not easy unless you're S.S. Rajamouli. Not easy unless not only you know what you're doing, but also are at the top of your game. RRR is essentially an action drama where Rajamouli has taken two real-life freedom fighters, lionized them as avatars of Lord Ram and Bhim from Mahabharata, and woven this high-octane fantasy sprinkled with a dash of bromance that's just pure fun to watch. This is Himanshu, and you're listening to the Love of Cinema podcast. Before moving on, as always, a quick request to all listeners of the podcast. If you enjoy organic conversations centered on Indian cinema, Love of Cinema podcast was created for people just like you. So do consider subscribing. Independent podcasts like this one don't have a platform ecosystem for amplification and distribution. Independent pods rely on amplification through their listeners. So if you like the episode, please share the episode on social. Also, do take a minute to review and rate the podcast. That would be much appreciated. Back to today's episode. To dive into RRR and help us unpack much of its goodness, we have a special guest joining us today. Josh Hurtado is an American film critic who writes for Screen Anarchy and Austin Chronicle. Josh is also a programming consultant for the biggest genre film festival there is, the Fantastic Film Festival, held in Austin, Texas every year. Josh is also a big fan of Telugu cinema and Rajamouli. And presently, he is collaborating with Rajamouli on ideas for future projects. Josh joins us on the podcast to talk about some of the stunning moments from the film, why RRR is first and foremost a Rajamouli film, more than a Ram Charan or a Tarak film, and why he believes Rajamouli is a special filmmaker who's on the cusp of an international breakout. We also chatted about a lot more, like the film's bonkers action set pieces, how Rajamouli's visual effects and CG always feel in tune with the narrative and the story, and discussed whether the director pushed the boundaries far enough once again. All things RRR with Josh Hurtado. Here goes. Hey Josh, how are you?
I'm doing well, Himanshu. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast and talking with us today.
My absolute pleasure.
So, Josh, I was thinking that before we start talking about RRR and Rajamouli and Telugu cinema, I just wanted to hear your story as to how you fell in love with Telugu cinema and how did your journey start and what is it about it that you dig the most? So if you could share a little bit about that.
Sure. Probably about 15 years ago, I was already a big film fan. And at the time, it was the Japanese and Korean films that were making a lot of noise in sort of underground and independent film circles and genre film circles, which is kind of where I find myself most of the time. And I just became very excited about looking in like under rocks, basically, look for new films and new parts of the world whose cinema I had never seen before. And at the time, that was India. And India was always a major blind spot. And if you talk to a lot of people that do follow independent film or follow genre film from different foreign countries, India is often a blind spot. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it has a sort of a bad rap in Western film culture as, the bloated Bollywood musical sort of thing, and which exists. Obviously, it's not a stereotype for no reason at all. But it's very intimidating because there is so much of it that knowing where to start is a very difficult thing to do. And so,
right.
I started asking people who knew. I was on, forums back in the day when forums were still a lot more active than they are now. And I jumped into some Indian film forums and kind of just started listening. And that's where I first found Rajamouli's work around 2007, 2008, when someone had mentioned Yamadanga. And so I went and sought that out. And then Magadira, I went and sought that out. Now, Rajamouli was my introduction to Telugu cinema at the time.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And so then when I went and started to branch outside of that, anyone who follows that kind of cinema will know that there's a large gap in quality and in style between Rajamouli and everyone else doing what he does in his part of the country. And so I had to get used to it because Telugu cinema is very closed off from the rest of not only Indian cinema at this point in the last, it's starting to, because of Rajamouli's work, it's starting to bleed into other parts of the country. But at the time, it was very, very closed off. And the insularity of the community and the film community, coupled with the fact that they have their own internal audience that they didn't need to count on money from outside of their population, meant that they had developed this sort of very particular style, very self-referential, very sort of broad, more broad than most of the other film industries, in terms of comedy, in terms of action, in terms of pure escapism. And the films are always constantly referencing each other, which, if you're an outsider, is very difficult to get a handle on.
Right.
But, and not that I haven't seen hundreds of Telugu films, but I've certainly seen dozens of Telugu films. And that's really sort of put me in a position where I'm able to, even if I don't 100% get the joke, I know what the joke is, that is referring to something else, and I can appreciate things in that terms, and at least in terms of the non-Rajamouli mainstream Telugu films. So that's kind of where I came from, was finding those, and then I got more involved, and now I'm here.
Awesome. That's a great story. And like you said, back in 2008, 2009, were you able to access those movies in cinemas, or you were essentially trying to get it on physical media or download them and watch it?
At the time, it was physical media, because around here in Dallas, where I live, there's a large Telugu population, Telugu NRI population. And so, the Indian grocers were also Indian video stores. And so I could go to the video stores there. There were still some shops online that you could get to. They're a little more, the numbers have dwindled quite a bit in terms of Indian video availability. And, physical media in India in general is more or less completely dead, at least for local product. Like, they'll still release Hollywood films over there, but it's really hard to get Indian films on any sort of physical media anymore. And so I would go to my local grocers. Eventually, I figured out that my local grocer was buying from an Indian DVD distribution hub in one of the suburbs of town. And so I went to that place and just bought directly from the distributor whatever I could find. So that was, I'm fortunate in that I live in a part of the country where there is a large population of immigrants from lots of places, but from India in particular. And so those things were not entirely inaccessible to me. Although I did eventually find in the next few years, probably around 2010, 2011, that there were theaters playing Telugu films and Tamil films and other South Indian films within reasonable driving distance of my house, 20 or 30 minutes. And so I started to go to those more frequently.
So let's talk about Rajamouli first, and his style of filmmaking before we kind of dive into RRR. And I'll tell you how I think about him. And You might have seen more of his films. I haven't seen some of his early films. But for me, he's a filmmaker who has made a reputation for his audacious storytelling and absolute bonkers kind of action set pieces. But of course, he's so much more than that, right? I mean, for example, part of his cinema's universal appeal, I think, has a lot to do with his stories, always having like a strong emotional core that serves as a base. And I think that's the reason why it connects, across audiences, across languages, right from Magadira and Maryada Ramana. And then the flamboyance and showmanship kind of, wraps around that core. Again, I always thought about Rajamouli as a cross between Manmohan Desai and, some of those 90s filmmakers that I grew up with, like, who were really using dialed up action, like Michael Bay and like Dominic Sena or someone, where he's marrying absolute adventures in ways more than one plots with, in the tradition of Desai, with dialed up kind of visual effects and action set pieces from the school of Michael Bay. And when that comes off, it all seems freaking cinematic. So it's pretty cool when it all comes off, and that's how I think about Rajamouli, really.
Yeah, he's definitely a filmmaker who takes emotion into more thorough account than a lot of the other filmmakers from the Telugu film industry. It's difficult to lump him into that industry at this point because like I said, there is a fairly sizable quality gap between what Rajamouli does and what the other Telugu filmmakers do, as well as the sensibilities of what Rajamouli does compared to what other Telugu filmmakers do. And I enjoy those films. Some of the crazier ones I really do like. There's a filmmaker named Boyapati Srinu who makes like full-on mass movies that are just ridiculously violent. The action isn't over the top. They're very preachy about morality and all sorts of things that if it was an American film, maybe probably would, be getting canceled at this point because of the stuff that he says in his movies. But,
right.
I have the luxury of distance from not only the home audience, but also I don't have any cultural connection to India apart from the fact that I'm just a fan of a lot of the films. And so I'm able to distance myself in that way. So I don't take that kind of thing on personally. But with Rajamouli, as you said, he has a very strong emotional core. He builds these incredible action sequences out of the core, and so it's story first for Rajamouli, which is not something when other filmmakers have tried to make films that cross over, that they want to cross over, or that they believe will cross over to a Western audience. They think that we're reacting to something that we're not reacting to. So with Rajamouli, and we'll get into this as part of the reason we're talking here. What Rajamouli does is he builds these experiences outward from that emotional core, and he builds the stunts and the action outward from what the story needs. And just taking what would normally be not a simple set piece, but an action set piece that you might see in a Hollywood or other foreign language film movie, and just dialing it up, several dozen notches. But he doesn't do that at the expense of any of the characters or at the expense of the story, which is something that other filmmakers could take a lesson from, I think.
Right. Makes sense. Maybe, just the right way of talking about the movie is just, we talk about some of our favorite moments from the film and, what we really dug about the film. So I had a few moments that I wanted to talk about. I'll let you start. So why don't you go ahead and what were some of those moments that really kind of, clicked with you?
I mean, there's so much
Sure.
in this film that I enjoy. I've seen it 3 times now in the theater. I saw it on the first show at the IMAX screening here in town. And I love the fact the way the characters are introduced is quite brilliant. And it not only gives you a sense of what they are in terms of their heroic qualities, their strength, that sort of thing, fighting off 1,000 men or, taking down a tiger with your bare hands or something like that. It also gives you an idea of who the characters are,
right?
Which is something that's very helpful later on. It sets up these characters in so many ways so that you understand physical and emotional characteristics just through these action set pieces, which is pretty genius. And then when they come together right before the title card with the exploding train and the boy being stranded in the river, that's where you start to see the flashes of big time Rajamouli come out, because that's the kind of thing that he's famous for, is crafting those big action sequences, and the ability that he has these days to make that kind of thing happen. Like he's got pretty much free reign to do whatever he needs to do. He's proven himself over and over again. He's not a risk for financiers anymore. And so if Rajamouli wants to do it, Rajamouli does it. And it's getting better and better every time, more seamless, which is something that a lot of Indian films attempting to make this kind of splash, they overstep a lot of times what they're able to actually accomplish. And I think Rajamouli is very good at understanding, where his boundaries are and where he can push them. And, the suspension of disbelief gets you a long way. The major thing, the one that made me stand up and cheer all 3 times that I saw it, even the last time where I was the only one in the theater with my son, is the pre-interval sequence where the
that's dope. Yeah.
Where basically a zoo jumps out of a truck, and it's insane. And it goes for like 20 minutes, and it's just one crazy thing after another.
Absolutely.
And it's just beautiful. And I can tell that they're not real tigers and not real stags and all that. And it just doesn't matter at that point, because you're just so entertained by everything that's going on.
Yeah. I mean, I just going back to the introduction scenes of Ram Charan and Tarak. I thought I loved both of those, especially Ram Charan's introductory scene. I found that scene really fascinating, not for its sheer intensity or the raw action choreography, which I dug totally as well. But the most remarkable aspect of that sequence, I thought, was, how it kind of does foreshadowing of the character of Ramaraju. So it, the first impression that you get of Ram Charan when you see his face and the way he moves and everything, it all feels like an android, like an, AI programmed kind of a killing machine, like some universal soldier or something like that, which is essentially conveying us that this man means business, and he's laser focused on his mission. He's a man on a mission, and as later we would find out, why it feels like that. I mean, where does that android esque trait comes from? When we see his backstory, right, with Ajay Devgan and his dad, it comes from the way that his dad has kind of trained him and shaped him, to quote unquote load, aim, shoot, repeat, that kind of a mentality. And so I just thought that thing is done really nice, where it's kind of foreshadowing as to, what kind of character he is. And I think Ram Charan was excellent in, portraying that and projecting that. So that introductory scene, I really loved. I think it's one of my favorite scenes. And same thing with Tarak's introductory scene, with that is just amazing. I mean, just the whole cinematography, the sound design, everything, especially the tiger POV shots. I love those. What did you make of the sound design in this movie?
Oh, it was great. And it's one of my favorite things to go to these films in the theater, because they turn it up. Like we have, over the last decade or so, as Indian films have sort of made their way into multiplexes more frequently, they understand that the audience wants to have the sound as loud as possible, and so they've tried to compensate the best they can, and within what they consider to be reasonable limits. So the sound design is always wonderful. I really wanted to see, because I know that Rajamouli at the offset had said that he had suggested for American audiences to see it in the Dolby Cinema, which I really wish I could have gotten to do, because I've done Dolby Cinema once for a press screening for Scream of all things, and the sound design was amazing there. I just can't imagine how it would have been. It was gone too soon. RRR was for me to actually catch it there. But
was it the new Scream?
Yeah, the newest one.
Okay, got it. Yeah. Yeah, and also the pre-intermission scene, like you said. I mean, that's probably the best scene from the movie in terms of your bang for your buck. But what I really like about Rajamouli is that how he stands out among Indian filmmakers. When it comes to visual effects, many Indian filmmakers I feel have a tendency to kind of clone the effects from Hollywood films. So what essentially they're doing is that when it comes to visual effects, they'll try to find something from a foreign film, a Hollywood film, most of the times that is closest to the situation in their film. And instead of using that as a reference, many of them simply clone it and try to like shoehorn it in. So, for example, recently there was a movie called Verge. I don't know if you've seen this Ajay Devgan film, a Hindi movie.
I haven't seen it.
Okay, which had extensive shots of an airstrike. And, I remember saying to myself when I watched the movie that they essentially replicated shots from Pearl Harbor, Ben Affleck's old movie. And that's just one example. And I mean, even in Koi Mil Gaya, like a big movie like that, some of the VFX are straight from, Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind or E.T. or something like that. And it happens more often than not. But Rajamouli really does his own stuff, right? I mean, they always feel the visual effects in his films. They always feel like they're consistent with the style and character of the story, the narrative. And, it doesn't feel like, maybe I'm sure that he has referenced them from somewhere else or, from a book, from a graphic novel or something. But they always feel consistent with the character of the story and the narrative. And the intermission action sequence, I thought, was a great example of that. Like with those animals just like jumping out, leaping out of the truck. And that's so nicely done. And it all feels so consistent with what the movie is saying or has been so forth, so I really love that scene as well.
Yeah, and I think it's as I mentioned, there are filmmakers who've gotten the impression that they're on the cusp of international success. So not to talk poorly about anybody in particular, but Shankar's films, he has sort of not the same, but a similar visual sense, a similar sense of wanting to go big on his effects, but and with Enthron, I thought it was great. I was less a fan of 2.0. I think I was okay, but
same. Yeah.
I feel like what's happened with Shankar is that he's latched onto the wrong things. He's latched onto parts of the films that he thinks people respond to that he can then grow, which is the effects. And I made this comparison years and years ago, but those two filmmakers are really the two trying to push visual effects ahead in the country, or trying to utilize them in new and different ways. And I feel like what Shankar's doing is, having ideas for set pieces and then writing a story around them. And, Rajamouli does the other. He writes a story and then builds set pieces that support the story. So even visuals that aren't hugely complex, but are still very exciting to watch, like in that pre-interval scene, there's a sequence where Rama and Bhim are facing off, and Rama grabs a torch, and behind him a bunch of fireworks go off, and they're swirling through the air, and with him being the fire and all the fire imagery behind him, and then it cuts to Bhim, who's in front of the demolished water fountain with the hose in his hand, and they're like snake heads or serpent heads flinging water everywhere. It's the same sort of mirroring thing that's happening behind Rama. And that visual, it's not simple, but it's also not as insane as some of the things we've seen, but it's just as effective. It's being able to use those things very effectively that I think he does really well.
Right.
To support the characters.
Right. And it's, some of the smaller things that Rajamouli does, right, in that scene and all over the movie, it's a constant, symbolic thing of the fire and water between the two. And so that's consistent throughout the movie. And the way that he weaves that in, that's also great, I thought. And how cool was the prison break scene?
Yeah, yeah.
Man, Tarak loading those guns for Ram Charan, that was take my money. I mean, I that's the kind of scene that I'm going to watch again and again, when this thing comes out on Blu-ray or, when you're watching it at home.
I know. I saw it when I've seen, negative criticisms of the film, which there are a few. It's open to interpretation like everyone else.
Sure,
everyone else's work. Some people are taking moments like that and sort of picking them apart and you talk about the implausibility of that particular escape. And I'm like, have you not been watching the first 2 hours of this movie? Did you not watch the first 10 minutes? Because in the first 10 minutes, Rama fights off 1,000 guys and Beam fights a tiger with his bare hands. So if you're looking for reality and or logic, strict physics in this film, you're probably in the wrong place. I love the piggyback escape sequence at the end. I think it's fantastic, and it's a thing that I think only Rajamouli could do for a number of reasons. First, imagination. He has a tremendous imagination, and he's able to these days put it on screen what he has in his mind, which I think is very. It's a skill. It's something that not everyone has access to, but also the ability to bring together two big stars like that does not happen in Telugu cinema. You can't have two big stars in a movie, at least not stars of that stature. They want to have their own films. That's right. And I think it's because it's Rajamouli, and it's this, RRR is not a Tarak movie, and it's not a Ram Charan movie. It's a Rajamouli movie. And that's something that only he could do, was bring these two incredibly charismatic performers together. And their combined charisma makes anything possible.
Totally. Yeah. That's a good point. And I think Rajamouli has a rapport with these two before, so he has worked extensively with both of them. So I think that helps too. Just before we move on from the scenes and talk about some of the other things, we got to talk about the action set piece, the climax. Ram Charan in quote unquote kind of a Ram avatar, flying with his bow and arrows and bodies of soldiers piling up in the forest. I felt, this was my interpretation, I felt like, I'm watching a mashup of an old television show on Indian television called Ramayana, which was essentially, a televised depiction of the epic. And I felt it was like a mashup of that and an 80s Vietnam War action drama. Yeah. Where people are essentially, piling up in the forest, with their hard helmets and all those things. And so when I just describe it like that, it feels fairly ridiculous and it almost feels ludicrous. But when you watch it and when it comes off, man, that was, I loved it. And, again, only Rajamouli, I think, could have, essentially got away with that. But he does it so well. And, he puts a lot of thought into all these things. I mean, these are like ideas that everybody can pick on, okay, so he has probably mashed up these two things or something like that, or this was a reference. But the execution and the level of effort that he puts into, bringing that on the screen, breathing life into it is amazing. I just thought that the whole action climax piece, I loved it more than the climax of Bahubali, personally. So, and we'll talk about the comparisons between the two. But what did you make of the final climax action set piece?
It's difficult to even figure out where that final climax begins, because it's essentially from the minute that Beam arrives at the prison for the last whatever it is 30, 40 minutes of the film is just the siege, the escape, and then the subsequent siege on the munitions building. But yeah, it's great, and it's so well edited. It's so well designed. The action is incredibly well designed. Again, it takes plenty of liberties with physics. Things that kind of seem silly in the moment, like when they're finally making their escape from the forest to actually make their final attack, and Beam has his motorcycle, and there's the one of the British is on a horse and he gets knocked off, and then Rama jumps from the motorcycle onto the horse, and it's all perfectly well timed. It's just everything it's completely implausible, but it's just so much fun to watch that it doesn't really matter, like, because we we believe in these characters. And like you said, with Rama taking on the avatar of Ram essentially in that last part of the film, it does free him, and it frees the character from the sort of constraints that a human person might fall under in similar circumstances.
Well said, Josh. I mean, just the whole movie, right? I mean, if I was to ask you, what genre does RRR fall under? I mean, it's so many different things. I mean, it's a fantasy, it's an action adventure, it's historical fiction, it's a romance. I mean, Rajamouli has essentially taken two real life freedom fighters that existed, lionized them as avatars of Ram from Ramayana and Bhim from Mahabharata. And made a fantasy kind of an anti-colonial action adventure with a dash of bromance that plays like, Hobbs and Shaw on steroids. It sounds batshit bonkers, but it's batshit cool as well. I mean, it's like so enjoyable and it's crazy. There's like nothing else like it, and which is what we expect from Rajamouli. So it's not a big, huge surprise. But how would you classify this movie?
At its core, I think if we're looking at ways to describe it to people who don't understand the reaction to this film, I think the most effective way to do that is to describe it as an action film. As you mentioned, it does leave a lot out of what the film actually is. But, if you're trying to sell it to an audience that is wary of a film that is 3 hours long in an unfamiliar language about characters who they've never heard of, then an action film is an easier, I think, entry point for film fans than trying to describe it as all of those other things, because that'll come along. Like you will appreciate it once you're in it, but getting in the door, I think I would call it an action film.
Keep it simple, right?
Yeah.
Right. And what did you make of it in terms of, did the movie meet your expectations after Bahubali? And do you think Rajamouli kind of, so to speak, pushed the envelope far enough once again, which is what we do expect from him, because he's a special storyteller? Or were there parts of RRR that you thought, maybe it's on the same level as Bahubali, but not that path-breaking?
I think that this is at least as good as Bahubali. As in terms of my own expectations, I'll be honest. I've been a fan of Rajamouli for a long time, and when the concept for this film was explained to me, or I've been in touch because I've worked with Rajamouli on a couple of programming projects. When they explained the concept to me, it didn't really make much sense in my head, because these are two characters that I'd never heard of. I was the audience that I'm trying now I want to see the film. Like, these are two real people, but I've never heard of them. And from what I've spoken with other people from other parts of India as well, like they've also never heard of these two freedom fighters.
Oh yes. I just found them out because of this movie. So.
Right, because they're particular to the region, right? Because all parts of India were having their own struggles and fighting it in their own different ways. And which they alluded to at the end of the film, over the end credits. And so my expectations were honestly fairly low. I didn't, even having seen the trailer, I was like, okay, well, there's going to be some cool action in there. I get that. That'll be fine. But the story itself wasn't speaking to me, when I was first sort of briefed about it, as far as what it was going to be. And then I got in the door and watched the movie, and I immediately went back and saw the movie again 2 days later, because it exceeded all of my expectations, which is one thing that I think we're starting to see happen with some other audience members from other parts of the world who are taking a chance on this now, that they didn't have any expectations, because all they know is that somebody they knew saw the movie, or they saw something on Twitter, or people are talking about this, or it's trending on Letterboxd, or one of those social media channels where the film is really starting to pick up speed outside of its quote unquote intended audience.
And craft-wise, do you think it was a step up since Bahubali in terms of the sound design, the visual effects, cinematography, and so forth?
I think it's on par. It's difficult to compare because there is so much more that had to be created from nothing for Bahubali. The Bahubali set was, I mean, they obviously didn't build all of that stuff. A lot of it was CG, and it was created from nothing. I actually was on the set of the conclusion for a day when I was visiting India in 2016. And it's I assume like a Hollywood set. It's honestly the only set I've ever been on, which is crazy that that's the first one. But the set only goes up so high, so that the set walls go about 20 feet. Everything above that is blue screen and computer generated. So they required a lot more work to make the rest of the film appear natural than they would in something like RRR, where they're working with not entirely real sets and locations. I mean, they do have to CG a lot of the stuff, but in terms of that, I think that's an advantage for RRR, is that they are able to use existing locations in a lot of cases. The cinematography is great. I think the effects are certainly on the upswing in terms of quality. As much as I love a lot of the action sequences in Bahubali, they look more like video games when compared to some of the stuff that happens in RRR that would be similar in terms of audacity. I think they accomplished more with what they've learned over the last few years.
Yeah, I thought the effects were a step up for sure. And definitely Rajamouli. You would only expect him to do so. As was taking notes, after Bahubali. So, right. And this movie was in the making for a long time too. So, it does show that it's a step up from there. In terms of tracking with American critics, is there a major difference between how the reaction was for Bahubali and RRR? What do you think about that?
I think there's more enthusiasm for RRR from not just critics, but also from the general movie-going audience. Bahubali was an event film. It made a whole bunch of money. Lots of people went to go see it. Western critics went to go see it. More went to go see the second film than the first film because it had built some momentum. It was number 3 in the box office, kind of like RRR was when it opened here. But I think that there's something more relatable about RRR compared to Bahubali, because it is a fantasy, which has its own advantages because it doesn't hew close to history or to real characters, and so it makes it a little bit easier to access for outsiders. But there's something more human about RRR and the emotional stories that are being told there that is appealing to film fans and to critics here. And it does a lot of things that American films, Hollywood films, are not really used to doing anymore. It is an old style, big spectacle film,
right?
That America has largely corrupted that with things like a lot of the Michael Bay films. Some of them are great, but they become very muddy and bloated and cynical. Which is something that Rajamouli doesn't do. He doesn't make cynical cinema. He makes very earnest cinema with real feelings, deeply felt feelings. And he doesn't apologize for it. There's no need to hedge on any of that stuff in the films. And I think people are responding to that as escapism,
Right. I remember there was a time, I mean, now it's not the case anymore, but I remember one of the kind of disadvantages of Indian films were the length of the picture, right? But now increasingly, especially with the superhero films and some of the stuff that Marvel and DC are doing, I think pictures are getting, longer even over here. So that's no longer a drawback. So that's cool, but that's cool to hear that it's tracking well. It's tracking better rather than Bahubali, because I think these kind of movies they're great, and we know and we will be watching them. But wider the audiences that are exposed to them, that's great for Telugu cinema, Indian cinema, and those filmmakers.
I think one thing that is surprising a lot of people, at least the non-Indian audience that I've spoken to and about, is that a lot of the things, like you mentioned, that are, and that I talked about earlier, that are barriers for people who want to get into these type of films. You know, the length, the song and dance numbers. These are all things that people talk about when they say, "Oh, well, Bollywood's not for me because it's this particular sort of thing." And you know, by Bollywood, they just kind of refer to all of India, which I then have to go on a rant about. You know, this is not that. This is not that. You know, it's. And then if you mention that on Twitter, thousands of people will tell you that it's not Bollywood. So it's a self-correcting problem, hopefully. One thing that's been exciting to watch is the elements of the film that would be stumbling blocks for a lot of Western film fans. That are those impediments. You know, the musical numbers, the action, not the action, the length of the film. Those are turning out to be some of the things that are connecting the most. Like, for example, the Natu Natu dance sequence, absolutely brilliant, well incorporated into the plot in a way that Telugu films don't often do. Not only showing the brotherhood between these two characters, their antagony with the British imperialists, they've got, you know, these very broad British stereotypes, but it's okay because it's kind of like in the US we use Nazis for that same purpose. Like, there's no one's going to make an argument that we should have sympathetic Nazis in a movie, and no one's going to make an argument that should have sympathetic British imperialists in an Indian film about freedom fighters. So it works out, and there's so much emotion packed into Natu Natu, and there's so much, you know, obvious pride from the characters in it that no matter what side of that you're on, that really locks in a lot of people. And there are people that are talking about how brilliantly done that song sequence is, who normally would hate seeing a song in the middle of a film. And similarly with Komaram Bimado later on, it is well incorporated into the story, and it makes sense. And it's, you know, it brings together the characters, the outside characters at the torture, so that they rush the gallows. And it's, you know, those are things that would previously, and under a less careful filmmaker, be distractions instead of being positive points, you know, selling points, which I think Rajamouli is able to do. And he hasn't always been able to do that. He does have some sequences in other films where they do follow the typical, you know, Telugu in particular films are very haphazard with a lot of their song and dance numbers. Their item numbers are very broad, and they make no sense in the context of the film. They're just there to throw a pretty girl in the scene or something like that. And Rajamouli is no longer interested in that because he doesn't have to be. He knows how to do this stuff well. I think that's one thing that Bahubali and the other films that he's done since Iga do well. You know, they all feel like they're very well incorporated into the film when they exist. Before that, it was a little bit choppier, but these last few have been great. And to see what could have been a deal breaker for a particular audience turn into a selling point is really gratifying. It's exciting to see people that are new to this sort of thing
Completely right.
appreciating those things that, when they are done well, they are absolutely as cinematic as any action sequence.
Any comment on casting of Ajay Devgan and Alia Bhatt? Like, for example, do you think, let's say there were some two other actors, do you think that would have made any difference to the movie?
I mean, I think Ajay Devgan does fairly well with the material that he's given. He's basically in one location the whole time. It couldn't have taken more than a few days to shoot. I think he's fine. I always get a little bit, and this is just having watched enough of these films to be able to recognize the differences, at least tonally, that watching him being dubbed over kind of throws me a tiny bit, you know. I think it's probably a fair bet that Alia Bhatt and he were both in there to appeal to the Hindi audience, to broaden the range of film goers for the film, which is fine.
See, but that's the thing. Like, let me ask you this. Do you think at this point in time, Rajamouli's films really need that? I don't think they do.
I don't. But, you know, it wasn't until Bahubali that he was really a filmmaker who people outside of, you know, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana knew of anyway. And so, having that film where he started to bring in some non-Telugu film stars to play certain roles, those stars were, they did help it cross over, I think, at that point. Along with, the addition of Karan Johar as a presenter in the Hindi belt. And,
I think that has a lot to do with it, right?
Yeah, and Karan Johar puts his name on something, and people are going to go see it. It's just kind of a given at this point. Do I think that he needs it? I don't think that he needs Hindi film stars. I think that he could have found, other Telugu film stars to do it. I don't think they detracted that much from it, so I wasn't terribly concerned. Alia Bhatt wasn't given much to do.
Right.
Then I know there's
both are, terrific actors. So, even in a small role, they're going to be able to impress you. So,
yeah.
Anything else about Rajamouli? I'm all ears and would love to hear your takes.
Well, I have had the opportunity lately to speak with him about the success of the film, because back in 2012, one of my first programming choices was Iga, and I wanted to bring it to an international audience through film festivals. And at that point, it was not a thing that concerned them at all. And it's one of the things that I've struggled with over the last 10 years of not only writing about Indian films, but also helping to program them in international film festivals, specifically genre films like this, is that the filmmakers, producers mostly, are somewhat myopic. Like they have their audience where they know they'll make their money, and spending additional money or additional resources on growing that audience to an audience that, like a Western film goers, is not a primary concern, because they have, a guaranteed cash flow from, especially Rajamouli. Rajamouli has a guaranteed cash flow. Like, he doesn't make films, all of his films succeed. They just do. They always have. And he after Bahubali and with this film, he's very excited about the potential to have more people see his films, because that's really what he's about. And it's been really good to see, the audience's enthusiasm. People who may have seen Bahubali because it's on Netflix or whatever the case may be, now getting an opportunity to see a Rajamouli film in a theater is a different thing. It's one thing to see a film like this at home, which will be great and is going to happen. It'll be available. But having the opportunity to see it in a theater with a bunch of people who are all having the same experience that you are, that's cinema. Like, that's something that Rajamouli understands and has for, as long as he's been doing this. And, I think that he is one of the most talented storytellers in India by far. And if anyone deserves to break out, at least not break out in terms of leave India and go make other films, because I don't think that he's particularly interested in that, or that his skill set is necessarily well suited to working in a studio system outside of what he already knows. But break out in terms of awareness of his work. I think he deserves it. He's worked really hard, and he's very, very good at what he does.
Since you mentioned that you have been interacting with him, any word on his dream project, Mahabharat?
I haven't talked about that with him. So no. We're his head right now. I can tell you is very firmly in. We are still in triple R territory. We want to see what we can do with this. And if they think I can help, then who am I to not try?
Oh, wow. Great. So you're collaborating with them for the next, or
just coming up with some ideas.
Okay.
Basically, we're awesome. We're just trying to see what the possibilities are.
That's cool. Great. Well, thank you so much, Josh. Really appreciated you coming on the podcast and chatting RRR with us.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. If you liked the episode, do spread the word about this episode and the podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the pod wherever you listen to your pods. Also, please do rate and review the podcast when you get a chance. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at loveofcinemasf SF8. Feel free to reach out there or by email with your comments, feedback, and suggestions. You can find my email in the episode notes. That's the episode. This is Himanshu signing off. And as always, thank you for listening to the Love of Cinema podcast.